"You are fired, Devon. Leave your viral recipe on my desk and get out," my CEO sneered, signing my termination papers. I packed my tools in silence, knowing his signature just signed the death warrant for all 200 of his restaurants. To understand how we got here, you have to go back 5 years. Back then, Thorne Dining Group was nothing more than a failing, debt-ridden 5-unit fried chicken chain huddled in the rougher corners of Chicago. They served soggy, grease-logged birds and generic, chemical-tasting sauces bought in bulk from cheap restaurant supply distributors. Douglas Thorne, the founder, was staring down the barrel of imminent bankruptcy. Desperate for a miracle, he approached me. I was a food biochemist and flavor development specialist working out of a small independent research lab. Douglas made grand promises, painting a picture of building a national culinary legacy, and swore on his mother's grave that I would have absolute operational control over the product development lab, along with a handshake agreement for a 2% royalty override on all future franchise sales once we scaled. I took the job. I spent 18 grueling months working 14-hour days in a cramped, poorly ventilated laboratory, running hundreds of trial batches. I measured Brix levels with refractometers to dial in the exact non-cloying sweetness. I calibrated osmotic pressure profiles to ensure the glaze would cling perfectly to the hot, crispy chicken skin without breaking down the structural integrity of the batter, keeping it crunchy even after a 45-minute delivery run in a cardboard box. The result of those sleepless nights was the Crimson Glaze, a deep, glowing red, glossy glaze with a perfect balance of natural sweetness, fire-roasted pepper heat, and a lingering, highly addictive botanical undertone that kept customers coming back. The secret to that unreplicable botanical undertone lay in a very specific raw material. The crimson herb, a hybrid strain of Artemisia purpurea cultivated exclusively at Barlow Organics, a third-generation organic farm in Oregon owned by Julian Barlow. Julian was a quiet, stubborn man who despised corporate suits and only agreed to supply the herb because of his personal respect for my scientific standards. We established a strict temperature-controlled cold chain logistics line to transport the fresh leaves from Oregon to our central processing facility in Chicago, preserving the volatile essential oils that gave the glaze its signature aroma. But I was not naive. Having spent years in the cutthroat food and beverage industry, I knew corporate loyalty was a myth. Before I officially joined Thorne Dining Group, I had personally registered and secured U.S. patent number 9482, 104B2 for the low-temperature vacuum extraction process used to isolate the flavor compounds of the crimson herb without scorching the sugars. When negotiating my employment contract, I insisted on inserting Section 9(4), the proprietary formula license clause. It specified that I granted Thorne Dining Group a non-exclusive, non-transferable license to use my patented vacuum extraction technology and the glaze formula. Crucially, the clause stated that this license was strictly contingent upon my active employment. If the company terminated my contract without proving a material, legally defined breach of contract in writing, the license would immediately and automatically terminate, stripping Thorne of all rights to use the patent or the recipe. Furthermore, Julian Barlow's raw materials supply contract with the corporation contained Clause 12.3, which he demanded himself. It stated that Barlow Organics would only supply the crimson herb to Thorne's processing plant as long as I, Devon Hayes, personally supervised the quality control and issued the certificates of analysis for each incoming batch. If I were no longer in that active role, the supply agreement would be suspended within 48 hours. Over the next 5 years, the Crimson Glaze became a national phenomenon, turning Thorne Dining Group into a fast casual powerhouse. We exploded from 5 struggling joints to 200 highly profitable franchise locations nationwide. Revenues grew by 300% annually. People lined up around the block just to buy our signature glaze-dipped chicken. Douglas Thorne became a multi-millionaire, buying exotic sports cars, moving into a luxury penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, and appearing on the covers of business magazines, where he shamelessly took credit as the sole culinary genius behind the brand. Meanwhile, my daily routine remained unchanged. I stayed in the lab, checking refractometer readings, calibrating the homogenizers, and signing off on the chemical analysis of each batch to ensure absolute consistency across the country. I poured my life into this brand, trusting Douglas's verbal promise that I would receive my 2% royalty once we hit the 200-store milestone. But as the 200th store opened, and Douglas began secret negotiations for a massive $150 million buyout by a New York private equity firm named Summit Capital, his greed took over. He realized that paying me my contractually mandated royalties would cost the company millions of dollars every year, reducing the company's EBITDA and lowering the acquisition price. He decided to squeeze me out. He brought in his nephew, Logan, appointing him as the executive director of culinary innovation to shadow me. Logan's real job was simple: extract my database passwords, learn the operational settings of the vacuum extraction chambers, and make my role redundant so they could fire me for cause and steal my life's work. I saw the knives coming, but I kept my head down, documented every interaction, and waited for them to make their move. The acquisition negotiations between Thorne Dining Group and Summit Capital were entering the final, high-stakes phase of due diligence. $150 million was hanging in the balance, and Douglas Thorne was losing sleep over it. He wanted to inflate the company's EBITDA by any means necessary to secure the maximum buyout payout. During board meetings, Summit Capital's analysts kept digging into our long-term liabilities, and the biggest red flag on the balance sheet was the 2% royalty override on franchise sales contractually owed to me. With 200 stores pulling in massive numbers, that royalty translated to roughly $3 million a year. Douglas viewed that money as his own. To him, I was just an overpaid kitchen chemist sitting in a quiet lab, leeching off the franchise network he had built. To prepare for my removal, Douglas appointed his nephew, Logan Thorne, as the new executive director of culinary innovation. Logan marched into my laboratory wearing a custom-tailored, double-breasted chef's coat, carrying an iPad, and sporting a patronizing smirk. The kid had zero understanding of food biochemistry, thermal processing, or microbiological safety standards. He looked at my high-speed centrifuges, shear mixers, and vacuum extraction chambers as if they were overpriced toys. Logan loudly proclaimed that real cooking was about passion and chef intuition, not cold laboratory metrics. He immediately began interfering with my daily operations, demanding we increase the ratio of cheap high-fructose corn syrup in the sauce to cut raw material costs, and ordering me to hand over the administrative passwords to the proprietary database containing the master formulas. I refused, flat out. I explained to Logan, with the patient tone of a teacher dealing with a slow child, that the Crimson Glaze formula was balanced on precise chemical ratios to maintain its shelf stability and viscosity during cold chain transport. Altering any ingredient without running a full 6-week stability test would cause the emulsion to break down, ruining tons of product. More importantly, I pointed out that under my employment contract, I was the sole custodian of the master database to protect the company's trade secrets. My refusal was the exact catalyst Douglas Thorne had been waiting for. He immediately began constructing a narrative of insubordination and hostility, hoping to fire me for cause and wipe out my royalty agreement. On Friday afternoon, the trap was sprung. I received a brief, urgent email summoning me to the executive boardroom on the 28th floor. When I walked in, Douglas Thorne was sitting at the head of the long table, his face flushed with nervous excitement. Next to him sat Logan and 3 corporate attorneys from the firm's legal department, surrounded by stacks of official-looking folders. The air in the room was thick with hostility. Douglas didn't bother with pleasantries. He slammed his hand on the table and immediately began accusing me of holding the company's intellectual property hostage, refusing to cooperate with executive leadership, and actively sabotaging the acquisition process. He declared my actions a material breach of my fiduciary duties and a direct violation of company policy. One of the lawyers slid a termination agreement across the table. It was a unilateral termination notice for cause, citing gross insubordination and failure to disclose company assets. According to this document, Thorne Dining Group was firing me immediately, withholding all severance pay, and freezing my accrued royalty payments from the past 2 quarters, amounting to over $1 million. pending an internal investigation into the damages my insubordination had caused. They demanded I sign the document, hand over my building access badge, surrender my company-issued laptop, and immediately write down the master password to the vacuum extraction server. Logan Thorne leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms with a smug grin. He bragged that their IT department had already cloned the storage drives on my laboratory computers the night before. He told me they had everything they needed to run the production line without me, and that my services were officially obsolete. Douglas looked at me with an air of complete triumph. He believed that with his team of high-priced lawyers and the intimidating paperwork, he had successfully cornered me and stolen my life's work without paying a single dime. I didn't give them the reaction they wanted. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't argue the legal definitions of insubordination, and I didn't beg for my royalties. I knew that showing anger would only give them leverage. I calmly pulled out a chair, sat down, put on my reading glasses, and carefully read through every line of the termination paper. I paid close attention to the section where they explicitly stated they were firing me because I refused to hand over the administrative passwords and extraction protocols to Logan Thorne. By writing that down, Douglas had officially documented that they were terminating me without an independent disciplinary hearing or any actual proof of illegal conduct. They had just handed me an airtight case of wrongful termination. I picked up the pen and slowly signed my name on the receipt line. I took off my security badge and laid it on the mahogany table, followed by my company laptop, which I had already wiped of all personal credentials. I looked Douglas in the eyes and said 2 words, "Understood." Then I stood up and walked back to my lab under the escort of 2 security guards. I packed my personal belongings, my custom-honed, hand-forged carbon steel chef knives, and my personal research notebook containing chemical data on botanical compounds. Logan stood by the door watching me pack with the arrogant smirk of someone who thought he had just won the lottery. I ignored him completely. I zipped my knife roll, walked out of the building, and felt the cool Chicago air hit my face. I knew the corporate house of cards was about to collapse, and Douglas Thorne had no idea he was the one who had pulled the trigger. That very evening, I sat in the office of Evelyn Ward, a brilliant corporate attorney specializing in intellectual property and high-stakes commercial disputes. Evelyn reviewed my termination paperwork, compared it with Section 9.4 of my original employment agreement, and let out a cold, sharp laugh. She told me that Douglas Thorne had made the ultimate corporate blunder. He was so blinded by the prospect of a $150 million payout that he hadn't bothered to read the very contracts he was trying to bypass. The termination notice, signed by Douglas himself, was a clear admission that they were firing me without cause, lacking any prior disciplinary hearings or documented legal violations. Under Section 9.4, that wrongful termination meant the non-exclusive patent license for my low-temperature vacuum extraction technology was immediately and automatically void. Evelyn worked through the night, drafting a formal notification to the United States Patent and Trademark Office, USPTO, to update the status of U.S. Patent number 9,482,104B2, officially revoking Thorne Dining Group's right to use the technology. By Saturday morning, a formal cease and desist letter was delivered via registered mail with return receipt to Thorne's legal department and Douglas's private office. The letter made it clear: any continued operation of the vacuum extraction machinery or production of the Crimson Glaze using my patented extraction process constituted willful patent infringement. Under U.S. patent law, this carried the threat of treble damages and the immediate shutdown of their manufacturing facilities. Next, I called Julian Barlow in Oregon. When I told him how Douglas had fired me and frozen my earned royalties, Julian's voice went cold. He told me that he had only tolerated the corporate headache of supplying a national chain because he trusted my standards. Under Clause 12.3 of the supply contract, Barlow Organics' obligation to ship the Crimson Herb was contingent on my active, personal quality control supervision. Since I was no longer in that role, Julian invoked the clause. He called his logistics manager and ordered an immediate halt to all shipments of the fresh herb to Thorne's Chicago processing plant. Outstanding purchase orders were canceled, and 2 refrigerated freight trucks already heading east were ordered to turn back to the warehouse in Oregon. The supply chain for the glaze's critical ingredient was officially cut. Finally, I pulled the digital plug, the real-time operational database for the vacuum extraction chambers, which housed the precise temperature curves, pressure adjustments, and moisture ratios required to process the herb without burning it, was hosted on my personal AWS cloud account. I had built and paid for this server myself, only leasing access to Thorne Dining Group through security tokens and API keys. The corporate IT team had never bothered to ask for the master server credentials because they assumed it was a built-in software feature of the manufacturing equipment. I logged into my AWS dashboard, deleted the API access credentials assigned to Thorne's manufacturing facility, and blocked the IP addresses of their central plant. This digital block disconnected the automated PLC systems on the factory floor from the optimization database. Without those real-time adjustments, the extraction machines could only be run in manual mode, which could not compensate for the natural variations in the raw herbs. By Sunday afternoon, every part of the kill switch was active. I sat in my quiet apartment, sipping black coffee, and looked out at the gray, windy Chicago skyline. My phone began lighting up with missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, but I kept it on silent and set it face down on the counter. I knew what was happening at the central plant. Logan Thorne and his IT staff were likely standing in front of the silent control panels, trying to figure out why the automated systems were throwing connection errors and why the delivery trucks from Oregon had failed to arrive. They had the recipe list for the basic spices, but they had lost the technology to process the glaze and the only source of the signature ingredient in the world. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The corporate machinery was running on empty, and I was completely out of their reach. By Tuesday morning, the silence at the central processing plant had dissolved into a full-scale corporate crisis. Thorne Dining Group's inventory of fresh crimson herb was completely empty. Terrified of halting the production line, Logan Thorne made a disastrous decision. He purchased tons of cheap, dried culinary sage and wild ngaiq from a local bulk distributor and ordered the factory workers to run the vacuum extraction chambers in manual override mode. Without my AWS server to feed real-time temperature and pressure adjustments to the PLCs, Logan ordered the heaters turned up to force the extraction process. It was an operational catastrophe. Under the high, uncalibrated heat and unstable vacuum, the sugars in the glaze caramelized too quickly and scorched, turning into a thick tar-like sludge that clogged the industrial spray nozzles of the homogenizers. The machinery, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, was instantly gummed up. Worse, the resulting glaze was a dull, burnt black color instead of the vibrant crimson gloss. It smelled like burning rubber and tasted incredibly bitter. Desperate to meet the delivery deadlines for the refrigerated trucks waiting at the loading docks, Logan signed off on the quality control logs and shipped the ruined glaze to 100 locations across the Midwest and East Coast. Within 48 hours, the fallout hit the restaurants. Customers began returning their food, flooding social media with complaints that the famous crispy chicken tasted like burnt chemicals and cheap medicine. TikTok videos showing charred-looking chicken went viral, and Reddit threads began speculating that Thorne was cutting corners with expired meat and cheap ingredients to prepare for the buyout. In-store sales plummeted by 50% in a matter of days. The franchise owners, who had invested their life savings into their locations, were furious. Under their franchise agreements, Thorne Dining Group was contractually obligated to supply a consistent, high-quality, proprietary glaze. Shipping a burnt, toxic-tasting product was a material breach of contract. The National Franchise Association of Thorne Dining sent a formal notice of default to the corporate headquarters, threatening to halt all monthly royalty payments and file a class action lawsuit in federal court if the signature glaze wasn't restored to its original quality within 72 hours. Simultaneously, the $150 million buyout by Summit Capital was frozen. During their final compliance check, Summit Capital's legal team discovered the patent dispute filed with the USPTO and the supply chain cutoff from Barlow Organics. The private equity firm immediately sent a formal letter to Douglas Thorne, stating they were pausing the acquisition due to material misrepresentation of key assets. They threatened to pull out of the deal entirely and sue Douglas personally for fraud if the patent and ingredient issues were not resolved immediately. Douglas Thorne panicked. He began calling my personal cell phone hourly, sending desperate emails that oscillated between screaming threats and pleading apologies. He even sent Logan to my apartment building to beg for a meeting, but I had already instructed the front desk to turn him away. Having been completely shut out, Douglas was forced to have his lead corporate counsel contact Evelyn Ward to beg for an emergency negotiation. The phone conference took place on Thursday afternoon. Douglas opened the call, with his usual bluster, screaming that I was committing corporate sabotage, stealing trade secrets, and that he would drag me through the courts until I was bankrupt. He demanded that I surrender the AWS database credentials and sign a patent waiver immediately, or face criminal charges. Evelyn Ward cut him off with a calm, freezing tone. She laid out the harsh reality of his situation. First, she pointed out that the vacuum extraction patent was registered in my name long before I joined Thorne, and that their own signed termination letter proved they had fired me without cause, triggering the automatic license revocation under Section 9.4. Any production of the glaze since last Saturday was a case of willful patent infringement, which carries treble damages. Second, she explained that Barlow Organics was under no obligation to sell to them, and Julian Barlow would not ship a single leaf without my quality control signature. Evelyn delivered our terms. I would not return to the company under any circumstances. If Douglas wanted to save his $150 million buyout and prevent his franchise network from collapsing into bankruptcy, Thorne Dining Group had to buy my patent and recipe outright for a flat fee of $4 million in cash, paid immediately, alongside a full release from all non-compete agreements. A long, suffocating silence stretched over the phone line, punctuated only by Douglas's heavy, angry breathing. He tried to negotiate, offering $1 million paid out over 2 years. Evelyn shut it down instantly, stating the $4 million figure was entirely non-negotiable. We gave him until 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon to wire the funds, or we would file an injunction in federal court to shut down their manufacturing plant. Douglas slammed the phone down without another word. I looked at Evelyn and smiled. We both knew he had no cards left to play. By Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, the pressure on Douglas Thorne had reached a breaking point. The board of directors of Thorne Dining Group, having learned of the patent dispute and the franchisee revolt, convened an emergency meeting. They realized Douglas's personal vendetta and gross negligence had put the entire $150 million acquisition by Summit Capital on the verge of collapse. The board voted to strip Douglas of his executive authority, placing him on administrative leave and appointing the chief financial officer to handle the negotiations. They knew they had zero leverage. Every minute they delayed, more franchise owners threatened to shut their doors, and Summit Capital was preparing to pull their offer and file a lawsuit for misrepresentation. At exactly 4:45, my phone lit up with a notification from Evelyn Ward. The wire transfer of $4 million had cleared and was sitting securely in my escrow account. Along with the funds came the signed and executed patent assignment agreement, transferring the ownership of the vacuum extraction patent to the corporation. Most importantly, the document included a comprehensive mutual release from all non-compete clauses, non-disclosure agreements regarding my general research, and any future civil liabilities. I was a free agent, completely detached from the corporate machinery of Thorne Dining Group, and $4 million richer. My first call after verifying the wire transfer was to Julian Barlow in Oregon. I informed him that the deal was finalized and I had received my payout. I told him he was free to decide how to handle his relationship with Thorne Dining Group. Julian laughed, his deep, gravelly voice crackling over the phone. He told me he had no intention of making things easy for the corporate suits who replaced me. When Thorne's logistics team crawled back to him, begging to resume the Crimson herb shipments, Julian presented them with a new reality. He demanded a new contract that doubled the price of the herb per ton and required a strict, independent quality control audit for every shipment. to be conducted by an independent laboratory of my choosing. Since Thorne had no other source for the signature ingredient, they had no choice but to accept his terms, permanently increasing their cost of goods sold. The fallout at Thorne Dining Group's headquarters was swift. Once the acquisition was salvaged, the board of directors made Douglas's termination permanent, firing him for gross negligence. His shares in the company were diluted, and his reputation in the fast casual restaurant industry was completely destroyed. His nephew, Logan Thorne, was fired alongside him, his brief career as a high-level culinary executive ending in disgrace. The story of Logan's shipping scorched, chemical-tasting glaze that ruined the reputation of 100 stores circulated quickly through Chicago's restaurant community, ensuring no reputable brand would ever hire him to manage a kitchen again. Summit Capital ultimately went through with the buyout, but they renegotiated the final acquisition price down to $120 million. The $30 million discount reflected the $4 million patent acquisition cost, the millions in lost sales during the week of chaos, and the permanently higher cost of goods sold. Due to Julian Barlow's new supply terms, Douglas Thorne's dream of a massive retirement payout vanished, replaced by corporate disgrace and a mountain of legal bills. As for me, I didn't waste any time celebrating with expensive champagne. I used a portion of the payout to lease a spacious, state-of-the-art laboratory space in Chicago's West Loop, purchasing high-end rotary evaporators, homogenizers, and gas chromatography equipment. I hung a new sign on the glass door, Hayes Culinary Science. I established a boutique food development consultancy, specializing in helping small independent food brands scale their operations, stabilize their flavor profiles, and protect their intellectual property before they fell prey to greedy corporate entities. I sat in my new office, looking out at the city skyline. I felt a deep, quiet sense of accomplishment. I had spent years working in hot kitchens and cold laboratories, watching corporate executives build fortunes on the backs of creative specialists, only to discard them when they grew too greedy. I had refused to let myself become another statistic in their game. I had built the technology, I had secured the supply chain, and I had waited for the right moment to enforce the rules. Looking back at the empty desks of Douglas and Logan Thorne, I knew that the real value in the culinary industry didn't belong to the corporate suits or the flashy penthouses. It belonged to the people who actually knew how to cook, how to innovate, and how to protect their craft.